people die with those regrets, which is a real shame. I never took that singing lesson, or I never went and saw the Himalayas, or whatever it was, right? Or I never said to that girl that I loved her, right? And that died with you. And that will be a regret for everybody. And I will regret things that I didn't say. I'm sure, like my parents have passed away now, and there's things that I wanted to have said to them.
Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Chat with Nomads. Today we have with us Graham Brown, entrepreneur, author, storyteller, and the founder of Pikkal Co. Hi Graham, welcome to the show.
Hey Rex, good to be here in the same island as well. In this big world, we're in the same island. How about that?
That is pretty rare, I have to say. And I definitely want to talk to you about why you chose Singapore as one of your base. But let's start with an introduction of yourself.
Okay. Well, I think you did a good job. I'm a storyteller. That is my job. I get paid to help people tell stories, which is my podcast business. But I would also, I think, like to talk a little bit today about storytelling for ourselves individually and how important it is to tell your story on your terms, defining your life on your terms, defining success on your own terms as well. And I'm, listening to some of your previous guests as well, how important it is to tell your story, whether that means going and living somewhere and living an adventure, or, starting a business on your terms. This is an important part of life, isn't it? Being able to write your own story, not necessarily the stories that we inherit from other people, from aunties and uncles and goodwill from, co-workers and so on. So I think that's a big part of it is, what I do is I help people tell stories, but I've also done that through living my own story and experimenting with my own truths as well.
Yeah, I think your story is very interesting to look into, which is why I'm very excited to talk to you about it. As well as I definitely want to touch on the storytelling part as well, because, well, I kind of think like the whole, especially for digital nomads, whereby, the internet is a space which is like kind of a big part of our life. That matters a lot, and so far that has given a new avenue or channel for storytelling as well. And I think that portrays some unique perspective as well as some incorrect perspective that doesn't show the whole picture. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So those will be very interested to touch on. So let's get started first with your story, right? You started this nomadic lifestyle for 6 years or over 6 years ago, right?
10 years ago. Yeah.
Over 10 years ago. Wow.
Yeah, time flies, Rex.
So what got you into, because 10 years ago, digital nomadism wasn't like as big as it is today. Not that it's super big now, but 10 years ago, it was even less, right? Especially back then, technology wasn't as advanced. So remote work wasn't as easy as well, right? So what were you doing beforehand, and how did you, what got you triggered into trying to go into such a lifestyle?
Curiosity, I think, is the answer. That you've got to be curious. I mean, straight out of the gate of university, I went and taught English in Japan in 95, which was last century, give you an idea of how old I am. And, like life was a little bit different back then. Obviously, Japan was a big thing. Sony was the Apple of today. And Japan was the sort of cutting edge of adventure, or sort of still at that point where it was still a big thing. So to go to Japan was a passport to experience new cultures. I was very curious about Asia. I wanted to go and see the world. There is a saying in Japanese which translates directly as the frog that lives in the well doesn't know the ocean, right?
Right.
And so I kind of felt that I was a frog living in a well, and there's a big ocean out there, and I was very curious about to go and see it. And Rex, I'm sure you feel it, and I'm sure your audience feels it, is that once it calls you, you cannot refuse. You have that curiosity in you, which is a fire. I mean, it's very much a positive force, and it can be sort of a restlessness as well. So I've always been like that. I've always been very curious. So, traveling around Southeast Asia in the 90s before social media, just backpacking, meeting just strange individuals. And actually, Rex, I tell you one thing that really inspired me in 1995 in Indonesia. And for those of your listeners that know a bit of history, in 1995, Suharto was still in power in Indonesia, a very different world to now. And it was still very exotic, traveled right out to the Eastern Islands. And I bumped into an Australian couple, and They were in their late 60s. So, firstly, that was strange. I was in my 20s, and here was this couple who were in their 60s. And I thought, why are you traveling? Why are you backpacking? I thought this is what we did as kids, as students, right? And I remember sitting and having dinner with them, because that's what you do when you travel and backpack. You just have dinner with everybody. Everybody has dinner with everybody, and it's very fluid. And it's such a wonderful, open way of meeting people and experiencing different cultures. And I remember they said to me, we retired 3 or 4 years ago in Australia. We had some time, and we'd done all the grandkids things, so that's fine. And we decided we're going to take up a new hobby. We bought some bodyboards. There's like short surfboards that sort of, they're about a meter long. We bought one of these each. This man and this woman in their late 60s, and we're going to spend a year bodyboarding around Southeast Asia. And I was like 24, 25, 20, 24, 23, 24 at the time. My mind was just blown. I thought, I've never, ever had this conversation with a person like this before. Somebody who I thought was at the end of their life, running it down, who was just going out there and living, a truly amazing lifestyle. And I think since that day, I've been inspired to kind of live life to the fullest. And I thank that couple as well for that, because it really did plant a seed in my head.
Yeah, I think like you say, when you're from a different culture, and back then, especially when social media wasn't as prominent, I can imagine coming from Europe and into an Asian culture, that looks really exotic. You know what I mean? Like, you come here and you're like, things look so different. It's not what I'm used to, and you don't see as much of this on media as people do see today, right? And then the other portion that we have always talked about, especially with a lot of my other guests, is the portion of people. Then you start meeting people, and then your mind just gets blown, because it's like the beliefs and the culture is just so different that I would say even sometimes your values and your own beliefs get broken because of that. You'll be like, maybe what I've thought about this thing is not actually correct, And so then that drives the thirst to kind of discover more, because now there is no end to this, right? I always say that the world, the geographical world, has a fixed limit, right? But the perspective of humans doesn't have a limit. And that is what's interesting, because then you're forever discovering. There is no end to this thing. There's no like finishing all 195 countries or something like that, right? It's just the more people you talk to, it gets more and more interesting.
You're totally right. It's about broadening your mind, isn't it? Look at where we are today, Rex. We've come out of 2 years of one of the harshest lockdowns modern humans have experienced. And by the way, it's not that hard. I mean, here in Singapore, it's been pretty light compared to some places in the world. And yet, a lot of people have really struggled because of this change. And yet, when you travel, one thing it does, and I think this is the key point about nomad lifestyle, it's not really a state, it's not really something you achieve, it's a mindset. And I would say that the key to this is agility. Being agile in mind is really important with change now, because if you, for example, are dependent on working in an office or a fixed location, that's really disrupted your business the last 2 years. But if you have built a business, you could be a nomad in Nottingham or New York, right? And you don't have to be living on a beach in Chiang Mai. But if you've had that agile mindset of like building a business, building it remote first, not making it location dependent, and having all those kind of mindsets that go with it, and that comes from being exposed to those people, there's not one way of doing things, then that really sets you up. It makes you more robust for change, for stress, and just a better way of enjoying the journey, because so much of it really you can't control. I think that's one thing you learn as you get older, is that a lot of these events that are thrust upon us, we can't control, and it can be very stressful for the entrepreneur, right? So being agile, exposing yourself to these different ways of doing things and different lifestyles is so important, I think, for longer term mental well-being.
Yeah, I think there's this balance between, or this similarity between both travel and, let's say, entrepreneurship, is the idea of uncertainty, right? And I think that's kind of a bit of what attracts me to the whole thing, because there's just this unknown feature there that just drives you to check it out and to figure more and more of it out. But the other thing that I've always looked at this, and I've always seen the flip side of the coin, is that, so I'm not a person that holds a lot of very strong values, right? So there are things that I follow, but in a very open sense, I'm very open to different perspectives. And I always believe that, the world is open to this perspective. The problem though with that I gradually start to realize is that sometimes you start to lose a bit of yourself because you have no idea whether there is a right value, because there's so many perspectives and values coming in, and there's so many justifications for this thing. And there are things that are really, there's no real clear right and wrong, even in a societal or a majority basis, right? And so as you start to open yourself up, there is also the risk of starting to lose yourself, because now you're taking in 1,001 things, and that starts to mix up like your inner chemistry. Do you feel something like that, especially when you start looking into different cultures and things like that?
Yeah, that is what I would call the re-evolution of yourself. That I think that for me has been personally part of the growth of being a digital nomad. That losing yourself is probably the hardest but the most valuable thing to do, because you grow up in a hometown and you absorb the identities of those people and the values, and you get a lot of good things from that. But at the same time, the comfort zone which you inherit, the way of doing things, the way of thinking, also makes it difficult for you. Not necessarily, it doesn't restrict you in the sense that, it doesn't give you the toolkit to go out and be successful, but you then are not exposed to those ideas of how people could be doing things or how success could be, because you absorb, that idea of the self comes with it a codified definition of success. That your definition of success is basically a magpie. It's a collection of stories told around you. So if the definition for success where you grew up was to, have a good car, have a good job, be a doctor, lawyer, accountant, work for a good company, etc., MBA, law school, whatever it is, then it's very difficult for you to do something else if you're not exposed to other ideas. And to be exposed to other ideas, you have to lose yourself. There's a saying, to meet a stranger, you have to leave your own house, right? You have to sort of go halfway. You have to let go of these identities and, I think, importantly, stories. And for me, it was, in 2012, I had grown a successful telecoms business. So it was just over 12 years old. And I had done very much what the typical success trajectory was for an entrepreneur, which was, give up everything, sacrifice everything, hustle, grow a business, expand the business. And then 10 to 12 years on, wonder like, actually, is this really what I want to do? And basically, I had absorbed the stories of success from people around me. I wanted to be this really ambitious, successful CEO. When I went back to my school reunion, which never happened, it was always the fantasy school reunion in your head, isn't it? Like, when I go back, this is what I'm going. This is the car I'm going to be driving. It never happened. It was just these fantasies that you live out in your head every day. The expectations of other people. I believed that was how I would be accepted and loved by other people, by being this story of myself, which I thought they would see me as successful with. But ultimately what happened is that I realized, actually, these weren't my stories. These were other people's stories. And so letting go of that and losing myself enabled me, and then, literally to declutter. And a big part of that was in 2012, we sold everything. I sold the business to my partner. We sold our house, we sold the car, we sold all our possessions, and we got everything into 3 suitcases.
So this is interesting, right? Because I do think that this mental barrier that you're talking about applies to a lot of people. Like I think if you ask the majority of the population, do you want to travel? Everyone will say, yeah, I want to travel, right? But then the thing is, to make it happen, you obviously have to give up some stuff. So it's like, how much are you willing to go in order to fulfill this particular priority in life, right? And I think this sort of definition of success is a lot of subconscious level of blockage that might not be very obvious to the conscious mind, right? That could be something that's stopping you from, say, quitting the job, especially in a society like Singapore, where it's moving so fast-paced, so competitive, and success is obviously determined a lot by meritocracy in a very societal basis, right? So what led you, what was the incident that triggered you to realize what you just talked about, that, hey, my definition of success was not based on my story, but on other people's story? And how can someone who might be stuck in this particular hole actually discover that that is a hole that they are in?
There isn't one epiphany moment that you might get in the movie, you know, where the hero wakes up and the voice is calling him. It wasn't like that. It was many small things. And, you know, I think if you have an open mind and you're curious, you'll be exposed to these things and you'll see these signs. A great example is, and I'll share this with your audience, is cars. So cars are very interesting, especially here in Singapore, because they're 3 times more expensive than anywhere else in the world. But cars are expensive anywhere, right? And what's interesting is cars are for many generations been a definition of success. You know, we can judge you by the car you drive. And at one point I had a nice car and I thought that was how people would view me. And what's interesting about car is that the average person spends 60% of their after-tax income on their car. And, you know, I'm not talking about just buying it. I'm talking about fueling it, insuring it, taxing it, maintaining it. And 95% of the time, it doesn't move. You know, it's in a parking lot and not doing anything, depreciating it. You know, it's not even an asset, it's a liability. And so if you think about that, when you ask people, now this is where it gets interesting, why do you have a car? They'll say, I need it to drive to work. And then you say, well, why do you need to work? Say, well, I need to earn money to buy a car. And when you start to see the reality of that circle where people are working to buy cars, to drive to work, to earn money, to buy a car, it's so obvious. And yet we don't challenge it because of the storytelling, because of the way you say the subconscious level. It's so indoctrinated in society that people are scared to not have a car. I mean, I don't have a car now. I haven't had a car for 5 years and I deliberately choose not to own one for these reasons. At one point in my life, I had 3 cars and I can tell you it was just trouble. You know, you have a car, it takes over your life. It's like in the movie Fight Club or the book Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. He says that the things you own end up owning you. And, you know, if you have a nice car, it takes over your life. You know, I had a nice car. I couldn't park it anywhere because if I parked it somewhere, I was scared somebody was going to ding it. I was scared somebody was going to scratch it. I was scared of everything. So it takes over your life. And that, to answer your question, is where I realized actually, this is in no way bringing happiness. This is a trap. And when you start to ask these questions, Rex, what if I didn't own a car? Well, what if I didn't have to commute to the office? Well, what if I didn't have an office? Everything falls apart beautifully and it's unraveling. And then you really get down to what it is that you really want and what makes you happy. But you've got to be brave. You've got to live beyond the expectations of other people and the subtle nudges by aunts and uncles and co-workers. And once you can live beyond that, like you said, a lot of people want to go traveling. But I read, for example, there was a Daily Mail, a newspaper in UK, did a survey. 81% of people said if they won the lottery, you know, if they won the pools or whatever it is, the jackpot, they would go travel the world. But you don't need to win the lottery to travel the world. That's the point. You don't need millions of dollars. You just need to be brave.
So you reckon like that is almost like a subconscious excuse that they are telling themselves, hey, if I have money, I'm going to do this. But even if they have it, they might not actually do it.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, well, actually, no, there's another reason I can't go travel the world now. It's because, you know, they'll come up with something else. Yeah, you can travel, I can travel. We don't need a lot of money. There's that movie, Wall Street, Charlie Sheen, and he says, you know, he's doing the boiler room type, you know, these phone calls, selling stuff, pitching on the phone. And he says, I hope I'll make a bunch of cash and then I can buy a motorbike and ride across China. But, you know, to buy a motorbike and ride across China, you need like $1,000. That's all you need. So we've got this, you know, we're kind of beholden our future happiness to, we're holding it hostage to these events that may never happen. And as you get older, you realize the time's running out.
Oh, so now was it, so when you decided to sell off everything, what was the most difficult thing to do? Like when you decided on it and you, obviously there's a whole lot of practical process that you have to go through, selling off all your belongings, and then you need to start planning, like, and you have kids as well, right? Back then.
Yeah.
So then you have to decide, oh shit, where am I going to bring my kids and stuff like that?
Yeah.
What was the toughest like logistical issue or mental issue that you guys had to deal with when you decided to uproot your whole life?
When you start the process, it's quite hard, but as you get into it, you really get into it because you then get to a stage where like selling cars and stuff like that is no problem at all. Selling, like household stuff, nothing. It's easy. And then you get to a stage where you get to the stuff you can't sell, like kids' toys. And actually, it's pretty cool giving kids' toys to your neighbors. It's really nice, like, because, you're not going to get any money out of them, but there's a really nice feeling that you're giving something to somebody. So, and this stuff is just going to get thrown out. So that was pretty cool. But the hardest thing, I think, is like when you actually start traveling, is the highs are highs and the lows are low. You don't have that support network. You don't have that comfort that you would normally have, just kind of living a normal life. And so logistically, even getting right down to the mechanics of finding a place to sleep and finding food is hard. You're on the road. If you're traveling, like we traveled around the world, we went New Zealand, Fiji, did the US, did the Mediterranean, right out to the Canary Islands, then to Okinawa. We just kept traveling round and round. When we're actually moving around, it's hard. Some of the times you're like hungry. You're hungry and I'm tired, and there's like a family. There's like three of us, and you're kind of, oh, what do you want to eat? That's the stuff that gets hard logistically. But giving away stuff, man, that's the best thing I've ever done. That's beautiful. You just feel there's like this lifted weight off your shoulders.
But do you think it was hard mainly because you were traveling with a family, or do you think it's just generally hard? Because I would reckon that if you were like a solo backpacker, it wouldn't matter as much per se.
Yeah, I mean, if you're traveling with a family, it's a little bit harder. I don't say it's hard because you're sort of, you're dragging two people with you. Like, and if everybody's hungry, it gets a little bit, frayed. Like you're trying to find someone to eat, all those kind of things. But otherwise, it's good. I mean, when you're traveling with a family, you have the benefit of not necessarily being lonely. Traveling as a nomad can be lonely from time to time, right? So you've always got that family around you. It's a different experience, but it's not harder and it's not better. I just say it's different.
And did you guys start like, because I know nowadays you guys do more like having a base and then you travel for a bit and then coming back to a base. And when you first started, was it the same tempo, or do you guys do more of like a lot more traveling? Because the hype is there when you just start, right? You really want to see more stuff. Was it like a quicker tempo and then you guys slowed down, or has it always been?
Yeah, we started out just with no real agenda. We bought a one-way ticket to New Zealand, which is the other side of the world from London, and then we just took it from there. And we didn't really have a plan, which was quite cool. And then so we really just kind of experienced everything. Like ended up in Fiji, on the islands and stuff like that. Just exploring. Kind of gets a bit boring living out of a suitcase all the time. So you want to put down some roots. And obviously, I wanted to get my son in school. So we landed at one point on the Canary Islands, which are geographically off the west coast of Africa, but part of Spain. So these beautiful little islands, in subtropical islands, where life is really slow, where locals drink coffee and just chill. And it's a great place if you love cycling and running and swimming. It's all there. We just landed there and we found this tiny little village school in the mountain for my son, where he didn't speak any Spanish. They didn't speak any English. But as soon as he turned up, my wife went there and literally knocked on the door of the school and said, with my son holding his hand, he was 6 years old at the time, just this little boy, and said, we want to join the school. And you can imagine the process is all like forms and stuff like that. And so the director of the school could speak a little bit of English, and he said, okay, how about Monday? It was like, it was Thursday, so you can start on Monday. And that was it. We didn't speak hardly any Spanish, but you went into school. It's very familial, like all the kids were like welcoming, and they just played football and sung every day. And so there was a real beauty in slowing things down and getting to know the local people, the local cultures. You can rush around and do your 52 countries, 52 weeks thing, but there's a real beauty in really connecting and slowing things down. And so I think you need to kind of switch gears a little bit when you're traveling and have a hub and spoke type model. But if you can kind of hit that.
I'm just wondering, and I think we are starting to move towards the Singapore point then, like what's your consideration when you decide on like a place to stay? Because obviously not being a solo traveler with a whole family, there are more things to consider on why you decide to stay there, right? Like for example, why would you choose to school your children in Fiji, for example? Because that's obviously not a very obvious choice, right? So what are some of these factors that you consider when you decide on things like that?
Yeah, like I would say, obviously, for me, like getting my son into school was number one priority to find a base, and having, that sort of stability at the same time is really important. So you've got to have a place which, you can have a family and live reasonably comfortably and still being an adventure. So there's many, many places out there you can do that, which is great. I think at the end of it, it's so important to do it on your terms. Like, maybe the Canary Islands aren't a great choice for most nomads. But, maybe it's not Chiang Mai, which is like, a great place for nomads to hang out. But you can have that kind of lifestyle in the Canary Islands. It's fantastic. So I think you just kind of get the feeling. Like the thing is you never know until you go, as you know yourself. Like you can read all the online reviews, you can join your nomad forums and stuff like that. But until you go, you'll never know what it's really like, what it can really feel. It's so different. Like you can look at all the data online about comparing this city with that city, but you've just got to go and feel it.
There's a bit of
so important.
Like there's always this question that people, especially like new nomads, they in the Facebook groups, they will always ask like, okay, so I'm starting out, where should I go? And then you will see like there's a whole ton of answers and all the answers are kind of different. Obviously the typical ones do pop up more regularly, but you realize that, for example, for a place like Berlin, some people love it, some people hate it. Like the artistic people love it because there's this arts and culture scene there that's very hype, but on the other hand, it's not exactly like super budget for those who are looking at a more budget travel. And for me, I feel like there's a lack of like culture scene because Berlin is so international. So then that might not be the scene for me. And then you start to realize that everyone just have a very different opinion of a certain place. There's sometimes this thing that I say, it's almost like a vibe to a certain place. Like I've been to Quito, the capital of Ecuador, and I was with a friend and she asked me, what do you feel about the city? And all I could tell her was that, I don't know, I just don't feel the vibe. There's just no like connection to the city for me that makes me want to stay. Whereas there are places you go and then you're just like, for some reason, it just rhymes with you and you just want to keep staying. And sometimes it's also because of external factors, like you find a community there that really blends in, right? So now there are like factors that are both internal, inexplicable, and there are like external factors that all contribute to like your overall experience.
Yeah, the community part's really important. Don't underestimate it. That traveling can be a lonely business, especially if you're on the road for a long term, more than weeks. You start to get into months. You start to miss communities. So places where there are communities worth considering, it's fun going to new places, but if you don't have places to plug into, you'll soon miss it. So that's always a factor. So I would say that the two main factors, obviously, one is community. The second one is financial as well. It's no fun being broke in paradise. So, having access to internet is so important. Like the longer you stay somewhere, the more important normality will be. And that could be like internet, things working, like infrastructure, getting access to the right foods and stuff like that, whatever suit your lifestyle. These become important. But if you're staying in a place for a week, it doesn't matter. You can deal with all the kind of inconsistencies.
Yeah.
But the key is just go and experience it. Like you say, you don't feel the vibe. Maybe I do. But it's just like choices in food, music. It's a very personal thing. But all like globally, communities, everybody will need that.
So what's the vibe in Singapore that got you to decide on it as a base?
That's a good question. I wouldn't consider it a nomad hub because of the cost, obviously. Yeah. I mean, obviously the financial part is important. But then there are nomads. I know people living here who are quite well off, who are living a nomadic lifestyle. So, it's just a different type of nomadism. They're not backpacking Chiang Mai, but they're, living part in Sentosa, part in Dubai, etc. It's a different type of nomadism, right?
Yes, different type of nomadism.
More luxury nomadism, but they're still nomadic. They're still, the mindset is the same. For me, in 2018, we moved from Tokyo to Singapore to set up a podcast studio. I was living in Tokyo and I love Tokyo. I love Japan, but as a place for entrepreneurs, it's kind of a little bit slow. It's not a great place to start a business. It's a great place to live. But starting a business, Singapore had more to offer. And also I could get my son into school here. So he's in school locally, not local school, but an international school here, which suited him because it was English speaking. So that will kind of check the boxes. Came here to set up. I think here's the thing, Rax, is that when we go to a place, when we move somewhere, whether it was living in the Canary Islands or living in Okinawa or living in Japan, or living in New Zealand or here, there's always a goal. I don't think this is necessary for everybody, but it certainly helped us. We would say we've come to Singapore for 6 years. for 7 years. And the goal is to get my son into school and to get him graduated. Or we would move to Japan for 4 years. And the goal would be to, get my son into a Japanese school, learn Japanese, etc. Or whatever it was. Or we moved to Canary Islands for 2 years. The goal was to do the Ironman triathlon, for example. So there was always a goal. And I think that's really important. You've got to have something. Why are we here? Because you can easily get lost.
Right.
Why am I here?
So I'm curious, right? When did you start? So this is what I observed from an individual nomad's trajectory, right? When we first start, we don't have a goal or a goal destination. Or we're just going somewhere for like a temporary event or something, or we just want to see a place, and we are just traveling in some sense, right? And sometime down the road, maybe say 3-4 years, you start to see a lot of nomads having this idea of building tent bases, right? And so when you travel, you start to subconsciously look into how well a place is suitable for a base for yourself. You'll start looking at like, housing, you'll start looking at like maybe a bit of the politics, whereas at the start you wouldn't bother or you're just moving, right? And then you'll see your mindset transition from like just traveling to like, maybe this is a good place to settle down for some reason. So for you guys, because obviously if you have kids, I believe you do need to think about that earlier, right? When was it through your journey that you guys started to find, when do you start to find yourself having this mentality of like, maybe this is a good base, or maybe that's a good base, and maybe the next destination should be a place that we think is a good base?
Yeah, after about 6 months, I feel that.
That's pretty soon.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, the need to get my son into school accelerated that. But I don't feel like having a base is in some way a lesser option.
No, for sure.
As long as I think it almost pursuing this, like constant nomadic lifestyle, I think is probably the lesser option, because we are creatures of habit. Even if you like keeping fit or eating certain foods, you've got to have a routine. When you move to a new place, it takes 3 or 4 weeks to get into the local area, and then you can get back into your exercise routines, and you work out what foods you can buy, because you're not going to get the same types of food. So having that is really important, because that takes a lot of the wasted energy out of living in a place. There's a lot of energy spent on just finding your next meal, right? And what can I eat around here? And this sounds crazy, but you are in survival mode when you're traveling around, when you're moving from place to place. So once you take that away, then you can really start enjoying life. And so having a base, I think you can really enjoy life. You can connect with local people. You can learn the language. It's important, I feel, to get beyond the kind of nomadic bubble.
Yes.
And just, make nomadic, of course, nomad friends, but also local people as well. That's a different experience. So I think this is kind of lost if you're just constantly moving around. But you should also have that ability to move when you want. That's really what it's about, not constantly moving for the sake of it.
Yep. Yeah. In the last, I think it was the last podcast, or last 2 podcasts, one of my guests was saying that digital nomadism is not just about the freedom to move, but it's also about the freedom to stay when you want to stay. So you don't have to be forced to move because like you run out of money or something. So being able to achieve that geographical freedom means as much as being able to stay at the place that you want, then also to move, right? And what's interesting in the last, I'll say 2 years, because of the pandemic, is that I've always said that nomadism has moved from a concept of homelessness to a concept of having multiple homes all over the world. And as much as we are starting to see remote work bringing more digital nomads, let's just call it that way, that people that are just coming into a lifestyle, that 2-year period, I think also caused a lot of initial digital nomads to start thinking about setting up bases in different places. Because a lot of my guests, I think, if there wasn't a pandemic, would have continued traveling. But because of the pandemic, they have to stay at a certain place, right? And now they got into it, they suddenly realized that, hey, there's this advantage here and this comfort that actually makes sense. And then now maybe the way to do this is to actually set up multiple bases in different countries, so that I can move maybe based off season, or maybe based off certain events that I want to go to in certain parts of the year, the calendar, So I think that is a very new trend that we are looking at.
Why not? That's the important factor, isn't it? Like, live life on your terms. If it makes you happy to do 6 months here and 6 months there, why not? What's wrong with that? If you can logistically figure it out and you can make work, then that's a wonderful solution. And I think now it's a lot more probable and a lot more feasible for people to do that. You know, you're seeing obviously a lot of nomad visas opening up, like Thailand and Dubai, Barbados even. So, you know, it's happening. And what was considered, you know, even this idea of extreme lifestyles, you know, digital nomading, like the idea of remote work is now becoming normal. So, you know, I don't feel that, you know, what's kind of happening, that lifestyle, there is an overlap of lifestyles between the mainstream and digital nomadism, which is interesting, is that they're both affecting each other. In, you know, if you went back 30, 40 years, vegetarianism and veganism were pretty extreme lifestyles, you know, but now they're mainstream. And in the same way, I feel we've seen a similar kind of extreme lifestyle with digital nomading now filter back into the mainstream, like with remote work. Mm-hmm. Everybody's now struggling with this idea of how do you manage a remote team?
Yeah.
You know, these are mainstream issues now. And so we've now got these lifestyles out there. And I think digital nomads will show people the way. You know, if you go all the way back to like the beginnings, like the early 2000s, and people like Tim Ferriss, Ralph Potts, who were the first people really to write about these lifestyles, very extreme. And people were experimenting, pushing the boundaries on this. But now it's like mainstream. You know, you could have developers working for large IT companies living 6 months in Bali, 6 months in San Francisco. That's normal. You know, so I feel you're going to see a lot more of it, not just from digital nomads, but from quote unquote normal people, which is great. You know, I think everybody benefits.
Yeah, I think the world is changing quite a bit with this new lifestyle in terms of both from the business perspective as well as, you know, the life perspective. And so is your team like remote or is it like local?
Well, we've got some here in Singapore, but we have team in India, we've got team in the Philippines. We've got editors in East Europe. Yeah, it's remote first, I think, is the important thing. Even though we have a team here in Singapore, I don't meet these people, these guys.
It's still remote work in the sense of work from home kind of concept, right?
Yeah, this is the key, Rax. I think, you know, it's like building your business remote first, even if you're in, you know, even if my coworker was right, I could see him over there in the house opposite me. Doesn't matter, because if you become location independent by default as your DNA, then really that gives you a lot of options and a lot of flexibility in how you want to grow the business. If you go in with that as remote first, even if your team's in the same city, you know, that then gives you a clearer pathway on the business model. You don't need an office. You don't need to just have local Singaporean clients. Mm-hmm. It gives you a lot of avenues for growth. And I would encourage everybody to start from that basic DNA, remote first. You know, we were doing this in 2008 in our business in London. We closed our London office. And, you know, in those days you had to have an office, but then we built that business remote first. And that taught me a lot of lessons, because if you start doing that, you know, the problem is that most people build businesses and they build it around this physical location of the business. I know you need to have it for like a restaurant or something like that, but most of the people on your podcast and those in the audience they don't need to be location dependent, but yet they still behave location dependent in a lot of the way they build the business, right? But if you go in with that option straight off the bat, then, you know, I think in terms of stress, it's a lot less stressful pathway for building a business as well.
And what do you think as a business owner who runs a remote team, right? And now that people or employees are starting to look towards like remote work as a huge criteria for their future career path, right? Do you see opportunities in like gathering more talents, or like how would you approach the grand scale of thing for the current scenario?
Yeah, I mean, if you go in remote first, it changes a lot of things. So, for example, if you don't have an office, then you don't expect your people to be in the office, right? So that expectation may scare away some talent because they want an office. They want to commute. They want to live that lifestyle. They want to hang out with their coworkers. But for those that don't want that, it's better for them so they can work from home. And there are people who want to work remotely, and there are ones who want to work in an office. So you're getting this sample bias in the kind of talent that you can access. And the second part to that, Rex, is the kind of clients. So if you are location dependent, your clients will be location dependent as well. So you will attract clients. You know, the client will say, well, as a part of this deal, whatever it is, I would want you to come into the office, or I want you to send your guy down to my office to do this thing in person. So you then get trapped because if you're location dependent, you have to go to the office. And if you have to go to the office of the client, you can't then go to Chiang Mai or Canggu in Bali, right, and do it from there. So you're trapped. So the tail wags the dog, right? You build a business around this location dependence, and the people you attract into that business will want that model as well. So you have to kind of start out early. And, you know, if you attract the right people who want to be location independent and not build around that structure, which, you know, is the old industrial model, like, you know, every 9 o'clock in the morning, we have a team meeting and, you know, you have to clock off at 6 o'clock. If you keep that out of the DNA of the business, then you'll attract the right people who are mature enough to run the business, you know, without sort of traditional lines of control. So I think it's sort of, you know, you end up becoming the kind of business that you want to be. So if you start off early, like embedding that in the DNA, you can create that kind of freedom in your business, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because I think there's a trap that a lot of new business owners might fall into, is that, well, because you are new, you're looking at gaining revenue and stuff, right? So every client you just try and take in. The problem though is that if you're not careful with it and you just keep taking in that sort of client with that kind of DNA where like they want to do like lots of calls with you, or they want like a physical meeting, and suddenly you just realize that your foundation becomes that, and it gets really difficult to switch off later. And also because the cost is now high, because now you're having to drop multiple clients in order to, you know, rebuild the base, and you're like, shit, should I do that? Because now that becomes a way more risky move.
That, in a nutshell, is the challenge of growing a business and also living life on your terms. It's going back to the agile point, really, which, you know, I feel that the key to, you know, living an inspired or, you know, or a different lifestyle is to be agile. And it's the same with business as well. Because if you think about it, that, you know, you attract clients who want to do business a certain way. They may be a lot more costly, and therefore, you know, it can't make profit, you can't grow, so you need more of that type of client. You can kind of get stuck in this trap, and people work harder and harder, and they can't get out of it, especially if they're a small business. What I found in growing businesses is that it's kind of like flying a balloon, right? You know, there's hot air balloons where you fly in a basket, right? And what we do as entrepreneurs, being sort of, you know, type 1 personalities, is that we're on the burner, like pulling harder and harder, like fly, trying to blast our way up into the atmosphere, right? Burn, all that gas, because that's our mindset. And yet what I found is that really the answer lies in just throwing off the sandbags. You know, there's sandbags, that the ballast that weighs the balloon down. Yeah, like actually, if you throw those things off, and those things could be offices, people, clients, the things that weigh you down, you know, resisting the urge to hire. It's such an easy thing to do, is to hire somebody. But in so many cases, it's the wrong thing to do, to hire, because, you know, rather than hiring somebody, you could figure out what the process is. And once you figure it out, you can automate it and outsource it, right? But if you can't figure out the process that you're trying to get somebody you're hiring for, maybe there isn't a process there, and maybe hiring somebody is not going to be the answer. But when you hire somebody, you take on cost, you take on overhead of time, commitment, and that's a sandbag in the balloon, right? And now you've got to like pull harder on this, like you got to yank harder to fly. But the braver entrepreneur lets go of things. And that is so, you know, even letting go of clients. And I'm sure for your audience, the hardest thing in the world is firing a client. But I would say the only way you can grow and live, if you want to live as a digital nomad as well, but grow your business, is to say no. The more you start saying no, the more you'll grow. And it's an irony in a world which encourages us to say yes and take every opportunity. But being very clear about who you serve and who you don't serve is probably the most important strategy for growth. And yet we all fall into the trap of doing it the other way around. And that's really part of the learning curve that we have to go through as an entrepreneur.
Yep. And like you say, I think it stacks up as well, because the more you take in and you have to handle it, the more you're stuck in this daily grinding wheel of doing the immediate task, right? And this is almost like very similar to scaling a business, in that ultimately, if you want to multiply time, you need processes. So actually, a lot of people are always, their day-to-day efforts are focused on what you need to do immediately, right? But the way to scale is actually to think about what can you do today to gain more time back tomorrow. But that usually entails putting in more time today for this particular thing that doesn't give an immediate outcome, right? And so if you keep taking in this sort of stuff and it start weighing you down and you keep having to feed it because you have to keep it going, and the fear of dropping it off or losing it just eats into you, the lesser is of the chance of you achieving like that flexibility and freedom in the future.
Yeah. That's sort of a natural accumulation of garbage, isn't it, in the business model, which sort of happens, just like accumulating stuff, isn't it, in our lives, storing things. In my previous business, I can remember just being in a situation where we were doing, our overhead in the business as well, at that point, it was more than 100,000 Sing dollars a month, a lot more a month, just in, like salaries and offices and so on. And at some point, almost double that. And I remember looking at that and thinking, oh my God, that's like every month I have to make $100,000 just to break even in sales. And that was so demotivating. And then I sat with my business partner at the time over a beer on a Friday night when all the employees had gone home, and we just sat there and said, hey, I think it would be a lot more profitable if there's just two of us. And I tell you, that was a very dangerous thought that got planted as a seed in my mind. But it was absolutely true that we kind of almost had gone through this full circle and to come back to realize actually it would be more profitable. And then we spent about 2 or 3 years just kind of decluttering the business and fixing it. And, it was amazing. Stress levels went down, profitability went up. But that is kind of what happens. It's almost like gravity, isn't it? You've got to keep flapping your wings to fly. Otherwise, gravity is relentless. It will just keep pulling you down and down and down. And that's the stuff that we accumulate in business. And being a good entrepreneur is not necessarily constantly fighting gravity, but constantly being aware of it, that the ego wants you to build up this stuff to sort of create this image of success.
I want to go back to the overall concept of storytelling, right? Because it's very interesting. Throughout everything that we have talked about until now, right? There is the part of like storytelling in the sense of what's your story to the world, right? Then there's the part of how does other story impact you and your definition. And there's your own storytelling to yourself, which is mental, which is what you just described, right? So with your experience throughout the whole thing, and you obviously, just speaking to you, I can see that you're someone that catches your own thoughts. You know what you're thinking and you're like, okay, I'm thinking this way. Why am I thinking this way, right? Let's start with what's your current story to yourself right now, because you started with the idea that your definition of success was based off the stories that other people tell you, right? So how has it changed over the years? What's your current story to your own success?
That's a really good question, Rax. You kind of stumped me a little bit there. Yeah, what is my story? Well, you're right. I started out like many people, absorbing stories from other people. That's what, if I wanted to be successful, if I wanted to be accepted, I had to be and behave like this. And so you absorb a title or a role, whether that's CEO, entrepreneur, professional, co-worker, whatever it is, you absorb all these titles, and that brings it with it expectations. And at some point I realized they weren't working for me. I wanted to explore my own. And then, I think that the whole process of decluttering got me to a point where actually all that really mattered was to be happy. And I know it sounds overplayed, but really, Aristotle talks about happiness as the goal of goals. Why do we start businesses as entrepreneurs? Why do we go and travel? Well, to seek out experiences, meet people, be happy. We hope that in some way that will fulfill something missing in our lives, that we will achieve things, become better people, will be challenged. And this is an important part of the journey that is life. Is going on that journey, taking the rocky road, leaving the comfort zone, crossing the river and going on the rocky road, and meeting all those guides that you meet on the road along the way. Some of them will trick you, some of them will be benevolent guides, but they'll all make you a better person. And therefore, I think, I've discovered two things. Firstly, this is really what my story is, I guess. The first one is that the goal of the game of entrepreneurship or digital nomadism isn't to achieve a goal, it's to keep playing the game. And realizing that, I think, made a big mindset shift in me, is that, I'm not doing this because I'm going to do 200 countries and then cha-ching, like I'm going to, the confetti would fall and, somebody's going to present me with some plaque or certificate. It was not that, or to, build a business even that would, change the world. It was just to keep doing it, because actually that's what I really enjoyed doing. I really, I was living at one point on a tropical island, and I was bored because I wasn't made happy by internet sort of Instagram sunsets and hashtag living the dream. It didn't make me happy. What made me happy was other people talking like this, like chatting with you, Rax. This is like what for me it's about. It's like you get to experience people, find out their stories, like connect with people. That made me really happy. And I learned that from not having it. I learned it from lying on a tropical beach, looking at the sunset, thinking, actually, this ain't what I'm about. What I'm about is like podcasting, challenge, the resistance, going up the hill is what really made me happy. So that was my story. Is like, my story is to keep telling that story. If I can keep telling that story, I'm happy, I'm winning. Like the day I stop telling the story is when I'm in the box 6 feet under, right? So as long as I can keep doing that, I'm really like living the life that I should be living. It doesn't matter if I'm making $1 million or $10, doesn't matter. What matters is I'm telling that story and I'm playing the game. That I wake up every day and I think, yes, I get to do this, even if I'm like feeling tired and not motivated, right? And then the second part of that I think is really important, is that the happiness part is that, like many people, I thought I would become happy by making a lot of money, getting nice cars, having a big company, and, becoming famous, all those kind of things. And none of that really made me happy. It was just kind of, it was just I got sold the dream of it making me happy, and I'm happy to kind of, sell myself and the idea that this is what was going to happen, but it didn't work. But what was really interesting is I found out what made me happy was happiness wasn't a state. I wasn't going to make money or like, sell a business and then, that's it, guys, I'm done here. Like roll the credits because that's it. We're done here. I've achieved. That wasn't going to make me happy. Well, I found out that happiness was a verb, which was, if riding a bike, for example, like for me, I love riding a bike. I love cycling. It's one of the things I love more than anything. And, I love cycling up hills. It, for me, is like one of the best things in the world. Like, a hill in Spain, which is like really, you're going up a 10, 20% hill. It's a real struggle. It's, you're suffering, you're sweating, your heart's going to explode. I love all that. You're surrounded by good people, you're stopping off and having a coffee, amazing views, enjoying life. That for me is living. And if that is what makes you happy, the goal has to be design a life where you can do more of that. And that is what I discovered. It's very, very simple. Your happiness, Rax, may be, doing podcasts or travel or whatever it may be. We've all got kind of different things that turn us on, right? And just ask yourself, how can I do more of this? How can I have a lifestyle where I just keep doing this, keep playing that game? Because that is success. Surely a life where you can get up like I do, living here in Singapore. I love Singapore. 10 o'clock in the morning, once I've done my sort of morning call, I can get on my bike, cycle down the green corridor for an hour and come back. And I think I love doing that. And for me, that is success. If I can keep doing that and I can build a business where that, I'm allowed to do that, I can have clients that aren't constantly pinging me whilst I'm on the bike, or, I don't have a team of 20 people who are constantly asking me for what do I do next, then that is success. So it's a very long answer to your question about telling the story, but I think that is realizing, what is it that pushes your buttons? What is it that makes you happy? And once you found that, then just design a life around it, because that is surely a journey worth taking.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the long answer, because I don't think it is a simple answer in the first place, right? Like when someone really digs deep to discover that, it's a mix of very different things. And I see it as a mass of thoughts myself internally when I look at the macro happiness of life and maybe the micro happiness of business pursuits, right? Like I know that there is the general happiness doesn't fully just relate to the career or the business I'm doing. And you can achieve general happiness, even if you are not, even your business is not like doing super well, to be honest. But then there is always this desire or practical desire to pursue business goals myself, because I see that as something that gets me going. Like it still creates like this engine within me that makes me want to do something. So there's always a bit of like vague line between like what I would consider, the way I break it down is always between financial freedom and emotional freedom. But that's not actually the best way to break it down, you know, and it's always like a chain of thoughts that, you know, just moves around, and it evolves across time as well, because as you grow, your definition of happiness might change, right? You might not want to do this anymore, and you might want to, for example, I might not want to travel anymore, I want to settle down, and that becomes a priority in life, you know. So it's a ever evolving kind of network of thoughts, right? So that's what I think. It's not exactly a very simple and straightforward answer, but so I want to conclude with this question, right, that I normally don't do, but I think it works here. It's going to work pretty well here, especially, and I copied this question from one of the podcasts I listened, but I really do think that for this podcast, it makes a lot of sense. So, you know that you're going to die one day, right? And if when you die, all your stories gets wiped out, right? And no one will know any of your stories. And you get to leave 3 truths in the world for other people to learn from your story. What would be your 3 truths?
Wow, 3 truths.
Yep.
Yeah.
Essentially, you probably have to summarize everything that.
Yeah, I will summarize. Yes, my epitaph in 3 words. That's a great question. You really got me thinking. You know, as a philosopher, I can't do it in 3 words. I'm thinking through it. I'll get to the answer. 3, yeah. By the way, I'm not detracting from the question, but it's such a wonderful question. There's a great book called The Regrets of the Dying by Bonnie Ware, who was a palliative nurse in Australia. Really interesting. I think my answer is going to be what she said. She basically, so palliative care is like when somebody's dying, like the last years of their life, you know, they're terminally ill, they look after them and just make sure their life's comfortable. And in this sort of like moment of clarity, a lot of these people start asking these big questions, obviously, because they're on the edge. They could die any minute. And then she documented all those conversations with them. And some of it, you know, the book's okay, but some of the conversations are quite moving, because you're right, it's going to happen to us all. And what was really interesting, she's asked, like it was globally, this, you know, they had all the data globally. They asked people, what are your biggest regrets, you know, of your life? And you can imagine, I mean, if you ask you or me this question now, it's probably not going to be as clear as like when you've got 6 months to live. Because when you've got 6 months to live, it's like, right, there's no BS now.
Yeah.
Like you window dress there, just tell it as it is. And it was really fascinating. Almost everybody said that the number one regret was spending too much time at work and not spending enough time with loved ones. And I sort of regret, I mean, so I reflect on that. As you talk about truths, I think that has to be number one, that, you know, the time really is running out, and spending time with the people that you love is the most important thing ever. And you're not going to get any of that back. And that's quite a scary thought, but it's also empowering, isn't it? Because it means that I need to make it more of an effort. You know, I need to like just connect with that person that I haven't spoken to for a while, or whatever it may be, you know, like, you know, or your immediate family, or these kind of things, because you will regret it. I will regret it for sure. And every listener will regret it 100%, because everybody does when it comes down to it. Nobody ever says, oh, I'm really glad I spent all that time in the office. I wish I'd worked more hours. I regret not working harder. Nobody says that, right? Yep. So that was the number one regret, which I think is, when I read that, it's just a reminder. It's almost like, okay, so let's say I'm going to die in 25 years, statistically, whatever. It's almost like that voice is 25 years on telling me, Graham, this is what you want to think then, so start working on it now, right? And everybody else here, I know it's a long way away maybe for a lot of your audience, but it will happen. And therefore, that's the number one truth, is that you will regret not spending enough time with the people you love. And so go and make a story together. Go and write your story together. Go and do that travel. Don't wait for this stuff. So that's number one. Number two is, I think the second regret was that people didn't say what they wanted to say for whatever reason. They kind of suppressed their voice. That may be what saying like about people or what they wanted to do with themselves. They didn't find their voice. That was kind of like the music that died in them, if you like. Number two regret was, it may be, for example, they didn't really take that career option or start that business, or maybe they moderated themselves to keep people happy.
They got influenced by other stories.
Yeah, exactly. And subtle nudges, right? That was, and people die with those regrets, which is a real shame. I never took that singing lesson, or I never went and saw the Himalayas, or whatever it was, right? Or I never said to that girl that I loved her, right? And that died with you. And that will be a regret for everybody. And I will regret things that I didn't say. I'm sure, like my parents have passed away now, and there's things that I wanted to have said to them, which I didn't, right? Because there was always tomorrow. There was always a moment when it's fine, I'll just talk about it tomorrow. And then there wasn't a tomorrow. So that's a regret that I harbor, right? And I don't know what the third one is. That's plenty. But yeah, I would say, I think the third one is not traveling. Maybe making that one up, but something like that. Not fulfilling their dreams.
Mm-hmm.
I think people regret that big time. And it's interesting, isn't it? I'm talking about regrets and truths, but I think we have to view it in that perspective, because we only know how valuable something is when we lose it. And it's the same with people.
I definitely do agree on the perspective that regret is probably the thing that I fear most, especially on my deathbed. That is just what kind of drives a lot of decisions these days as well. Like just thinking like when you're uncertain about a certain thing, or it might not really even seem to be the very best idea, but you just want to know the answer, right? So just do that thing, just for the sake that you don't have to.
What's your regret, number one regret at the moment? What do you think at the moment, Rex? Share with your listeners.
I definitely think it's health. Like I definitely think I could have taken way better care of my own health when I'm younger compared to now. Like now I'm having like.
But you're a young lad. How old are you?
I know. I'm 33, 34.
You've still got plenty of time.
Yeah, but I do think my lifestyle is healthy in the sense that I work out and stuff. But it's just that I sit so often, and especially during the pandemic, because you couldn't go out. So I was on the desk, I was on my laptop all day, every day. And that's why you can see that I'm doing the podcast now when I'm standing. So nowadays I stand a lot just to work. And I definitely see the effect of like, it's better to prevent than to cure. Because like if I had just not like have had a better posture, invest in like better equipments of like a workstation, that would be like a lot better. And now like having like just a bit of big sore and I'm sitting down. So that is definitely a big thing for me in terms of like regret, and it's just hard to change, right? I mean, health, you just have to keep nursing it back. Family is big, but that's what I'm very focused on right now. Like that's one of the reasons why I'm staying here like a bit longer, because I know like that is important to spend time with my parents, particularly because that is the so-called time-sensitive ones. So those are probably the two big
These are good motivators though, right? It's kind of like, when you in the old days when you were going on vacation and you had to go on vacation and you were going like next week and you left everything to like 2 days before, when you just finish everything up. Remarkably, your work rate at the office doubled. Productivity went up. You got everything done. You bought those things, you finished off those jobs, and then boom, you went on vacation. It's kind of like that, isn't it? You've got to have these hard stops in life. And one of those hard stops is death, right?
Yeah.
That actually, we don't have long. And I'm 50 now, almost 50 this year. And you're 33, and it's like, I'm the irony is, in my head, I'm the same guy as when I'm 17 in my head. I haven't changed at all. I'm still a 17-year-old kid in my head. But at some point, I'm in a 50-year-old body. And so it's I'm going to imagine a point where, I'm like 75 and think that, whoa, that went really fast. I can remember everything goes so fast, and it's just a blink of an eye, and then it's gone. And so, to all your listeners, like the regret is so powerful, and it's such a great motivator, is that, if you're thinking about going and doing things, just do it. You're not going to die. If you buy a backpack and go to Chiang Mai or Quito or wherever, you're not going to die doing it. And you leave for a year and you leave a job and you come back, you find another job, right? It's not going to change anything.
That's definitely true. And I think that is especially true for people who are born in Singapore or comes from Singapore, because I do think one of the main thing was that we have the privilege of having a low unemployment rate. And that is something that me and my brother have always talked about when it comes to starting your own business and entrepreneurship. Like, you will never starve to death here. Like, worst come to worst, we will be able to find a job. Like, even though it might not be the best job or the well-paid job, but we will be able to find a job that freaking feed ourselves at least, right? So go and try these things that you want to do, take a risk and do it. You know, so if you happen to come from, like, especially a more privileged position of being able to do these things, there is really no big reason that this should stop you from, you know, going out to finding your own voice and, you know, resolving the regret that might happen when you die.
Go and do it. Like, think of the stories that you could create, the memories you're going to create. You know, that's worth it. Even if you like come back and you struggle and you have to go into a low paid job, whatever, you'll find your way out eventually. You'll get back. But the memories you create that's what it's about, because that's all you have at the end of the day when you look back on things.
Yep. Okay, and to conclude, the last question for you, Graham.
One more.
Yes, what's your definition of freedom?
Freedom. I'll use a Bob Dylan quote. Freedom is when a man wakes up in the morning and goes to bed at night, and in between he does what he likes.
Awesome. Sounds really practical and straightforward. I do think that that's actually a very good definition. Okay, and if any of the listeners want to connect with you, how do they find you?
Yeah, go to my website where I've got details about podcast guesting and also podcast agency. So go to grahamdbrown.com. It's with a D. Has to have a D for David in the middle, because Graham Brown is a wallpaper company. Yeah, so it's Graham D. Brown.
Awesome. I will drop your links anyway in the show notes. So if anyone can't find it by typing, always check the show notes. All right. Thank you, Graham, for coming on today. Great conversation. I think we actually do have a lot to talk about, but we managed to cover, I think, the important points that I wanted to talk about.
Thank you, Rex, for being such a good host.